All right, good morning, everybody. I apologize I can't be here today to help you study for your midterm, but this will make sure that you have the information that you need, kind of consolidating everything that we've covered in class. I do realize it's a lot, and this will give us the opportunity to bring it together. And if you guys can't read something that I do write, please send me an email, and I'll make sure that you have that information. So starting out, we're going to go back to where we began the semester, which is the beginning of really the Paleolithic era and going through that. And so understand that we really look at how the human race has interacted with the world around it. So most specifically, what we're going to focus on here is with the environment. So it says the interaction of geography and climate with the development of human society. And so the main thing that we see that humans are able to do are adapt. And because humans are able to adapt to the climate, it allows them to follow herds of animals in on several different continents. And following of animal migration is the most important part of this era of human history, mostly because when you follow the animals, we're talking about you can only have a certain number of people within your tribe or within your clan, and you really are at the mercy of the animals and your effectiveness of hunting them, which ultimately led to the downside of mammoths and large herd animals because humans essentially had gotten too good at killing these animals, and also with the tool improvement, with better stone tools, and then going to early iron and bronze tools, humans just really knocked it out of the park here. And so what we really look at is humans migrate through 90% of human existence. And then the last thing that we see as far as movement and interaction is with the last ice age. And this ice age was about 40,000 years ago, and also it created this land bridge over the Bering Straits, which ultimately allowed humans to come into North and South America. So we talk about people coming out of Africa specifically and migrating, following the animals, following them where they go, and then ultimately with the last ice age, that's when we see the first human beings in North and South America. So as far as the growth of population, you would really say that in a hunter and gatherer culture, your populations are really going to be much smaller. And so we're really talking about maybe 20 to 50 people. And this is different when things grow. Ultimately, when we get to the time of nomadic tribes, right? And the main thing we see with the nomadic tribes are the domestication of animals. And those animals being domesticated do allow you to have more people within that you can sustain within your small society, so maybe 50 plus. And then really once we get to the farming, this is really where societies can create this cohesive civilization because of the sedentary farming. So getting into this Neolithic era, really what separates us is looking at cultures that are still nomadic. And this is really the first time we see the, like I mentioned, the domestication of animals. But most importantly, sedentary farming is really what transforms human beings from being totally mobile, totally at the mercy of the tribes of animals, and herds of animals, excuse me, and ultimately now they're able to settle down in one location, and really most of these locations happen to be next to rivers. So as far as the major development, I mean we're really looking at okay, so we'll say rivers, and some examples that we could put of the early river civilizations. You could say the Hittites, who are in Anatolia, so in modern day Turkey. You have the Egyptians, and then the two major civilizations that we're going to have in Mesopotamia are the Sumerians, and then eventually the Babylonians. So each of these would be good examples of your early civilizations. And they're going to have things like food storage, food surplus. They're going to have the ability to support a much larger group of individuals. Okay, so moving along at the major developments, and these are the major developments within the agricultural revolution. So starting around 8000 BCE, humans are now transforming from being more nomadic and moving around to now staying in one place. So with the agriculture, with a food surplus, what we really see is this leads to population increase. So the impact of this is that when you have more food, you have really more people that will spring up. People are happy because they have full bellies, and so more and more people will come, and you can support that number of people. The other thing that we see is the idea of specifically planting seeds. You are putting the seeds in the ground on purpose with the intention of growing food and really coming back to it. And then we also see domestication of animals. So before we would really see things like pigs and sheep and goats. And now as far as domestication animals, we're seeing more of stock animals. So things like oxen, especially in places like Mesopotamia where you need them to pull the cart. And you use the animals for irrigation as well. And so this is one of the major technological things that we see is the irrigation, mostly in Mesopotamia, but we do see it in other places as well. And even the simple concept of a city, the place that you're going to have all of your trade, all of your people are going to be living here, and so all the major functions of society and human life are going to take place in one populous center. And then the other thing that we see is a great increase in quality of the weapons and really the military as well. And as far as the military, we now need to protect the land because there's only so much farmland, and the farmland is going to run out. And then this also relates to the cities because the cities are trying to provide protection for the society, and so the cities would actually be walled. So you think of like ancient Troy having walls, and so the ancient Mesopotamian city-states would also have these similar types of walls. And then as far as the farming tools, we're talking about wheeled carts, being able to utilize these. And then as far as the weapons too, we're talking bronze and eventually iron as far as the makeup of the weapons. Now, this is very good as far as sustaining human population, but as an impact on the environment, this is probably one of the worst things you can do. And so as far as the impact on the environment, it's really using what we call slash and burn techniques or tactics. And so what this means is you're going out and you're burning down plants and vegetation in order to create a space where you can grow your crops and your agriculture. And so another thing too is because you're cramming more and more people into one area, really we have an issue of disease in the cities. So you're much more likely to get sick if you live in one of the walled cities. You are maybe protected from a military conquest, but this is a big issue here. Now, as far as a shift from the social structure, what you could say is agriculture leads to a sophisticated social structure. Let me pull this down. And it also creates gender inequality. So what we're looking at is the times of the hunter-gatherers are really the most egalitarian that we ever have human society. Fortunately, that was 90% of human society, but now is really when we see, so this is really coming around 3000 BCE, really to the present is where we see these issues of gender norms, really because the social structure is not necessarily a good thing for females. As far as a civilization, this is a very important word because you would not have seen, quote unquote, a civilization until the use of agriculture, and really just civilization couldn't have been possible. And what we're looking at is you have different qualities that make up a civilization. So things like agriculture, You will also have, actually, can't read that. And then in addition to the agriculture, you're going to have other things like a food surplus. You're going to have social stratification, so some sort of pyramid. And then this is also where we get the term civilized versus uncivilized. And this goes back to the social stratification, not just against gender lines, but against class lines, socioeconomic lines, because this concept of you live in the city, you subscribe to our culture, you are civilized, whereas those who do not are uncivilized, a kind of us against them mentality. Okay, so this is it for page 1. Go ahead and flip it over. Okay, for page 2, this is really where we get into the river civilization. So when I say river civilization, it really is including those first civilizations, first societies that had grown with the use of agriculture, and what had enabled them to use that agriculture was the rivers that they decided to settle by. And so as far as building up these cultures, I'm just going to go through them one by one, go Mesopotamia, Egypt, Indus Valley, and then the other cultures that we talked about in just a brief form. So as far as the culture goes, what are some things that would be developed in Mesopotamia that we could consider to be civilized? Would be things like cuneiform, just as the written pictorial representation of language. And so this is ultimately the first time where you could say that history is recorded in a written form, and the cuneiform is pictorial representation, so it is a symbolic representation. We don't have script like you would consider with the Phoenicians. As far as agriculture goes, or I'm sorry, architecture goes, you do have pyramids in the form of what are called ziggurats. The concept would be to get higher to the heavens in that regard, and really it would reinforce the power of each king who was revered as a deity, but also to say, hey, look at how much power I have. Look at this massive building that I can put up here. Now, understand that a lot of the culture with Mesopotamia goes into their irregular flooding. And the reason why this is important, and how we know how much of an impact this had on the culture in Mesopotamia, are really things like in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is a king and ultimately is a deity as well, but it also depicts a negative connotation of the flooding within Mesopotamia, which will counter with the flooding in Egypt. And so with this flooding, you do see it in their literature, but you also understand you see it in the technology down here, which are things like wheels. You don't have wheels until much later in Egypt through trade. The wheel was developed in Mesopotamia because you couldn't grow your crops as close to the riverbanks, and so you needed a way to carry that water from the riverbanks, put it in pottery, put it in the cart, and then take it over to your fields. As far as the religion goes, they were very much polytheistic, and we see this in the Epic of Gilgamesh and throughout the entire history, both as the Sumerian society and then later as the Babylonian Empire that will conquer both upper and lower Tigris and Euphrates. We really see that the king is seen as a deity, and this is different than Egypt, which we'll get into in just a moment. And then the only other thing I want to point out as far as culture goes is they did trade, and a lot of their trade was with Egypt and the Indus Valley. And so a lot of these ideas are being spread throughout the existence of both the Sumerian and the Babylonian empires. As far as political and social structure goes, we can draw a triangle here on the left, and you would really see the king at the top, of course, but understand that the king is also divine. The king is thought of as a deity in its own right. And then underneath that, this is where you have the elite, the business elite, the wealthy, even your religious priests. Then you would have kind of a skilled workers class. You would have artisans and scribes and things like that. And then at the very bottom, you would have unskilled, um, not unkilled, unskilled, which farming may be a skilled labor in our minds, but in Mesopotamian society, farming would be considered unskilled. So some of the ironies of civilization is the actual instrument that allows us to have this large society and enhance this culture comes from the agriculture, and yet those who are conducting the agriculture are not necessarily seen in a high regard. And so the power of the king is really emphasized through various codes, the most famous one being the Code of Hammurabi. And the Code of Hammurabi really embodies the idea of lex talionis, which we know as an eye for an eye. So a lot of this idea of retaliation is a mainstay of the culture within Mesopotamia. And then we really see another issue of gender issues, gender roles, right? Women are lesser in society, unfortunately. And this is an example of when we go back to our definition of civilization, this is much more common than uncommon. As far as the technology goes, I mentioned the wheel. The other idea are the walls in the city, and really as a form of protection. But also we see concepts that become much more complex, such as city planning. So this concept that you can just build something wherever you want, and then it's this huge urban sprawl. It's not very nice, it's not very pretty, and so we really see mindful effort in planning different cities. One city that comes to mind is the city of along the Tigris River, and so this would be an example. And then even going with this, with the city planning and the wheels, is the irrigation. And ultimately, you don't need to know years for your actual midterm, but in case you were curious, as far as Mesopotamia goes, we're really talking about 3000 BCE, and really Mesopotamian culture, we could say, goes until about 1000 BCE. And one thing we'll get into in a moment is around this 1200 BCE mark. This is where the ancient Hebrews, the ancient Jews, are going to break away from Mesopotamian culture and settle in different regions. So that's Mesopotamia. Going into Egypt, some similarities, some differences. Going into the culture, there's one book that I really think helps contrast the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is The Gift of the Nile. And the reason why the Gift of the Nile is important is it really shows how the ancient Egyptians had regular flooding, very different than the Mesopotamians, and it also showed us that the Egyptians were able to use a lot of what was around them, and using papyrus reeds as far as paper is an important concept. The paper that we use today is more of an invention of the Chinese, but this papyrus writing is something that was eventually traded with the Mesopotamians as well, and so a lot of the writing that we have are either in stone or written on papyrus with ink. Another aspect of the culture is understanding the human body. And so really from a physiological standpoint, you have this Book of the Dead. And so a lot of what was written in here, mostly covering how to properly embalm a pharaoh, a political and religious leader, but the Book of the Dead really shows a really detailed knowledge of anatomy. Something that will influence Galenic physiology when we get to the Greeks, but ultimately a lot of what we see in this book has come out to be accurate. So that's as far as the culture goes. We talk about things like hieroglyphics. We talk about things like pyramids, which are directly similar to Mesopotamia. We talk about things like a polytheistic religion as well. And so getting into the actual political and social structure here, if I draw a pyramid over here, same thing as Mesopotamia. You have the king at the top. In this case, we call it a pharaoh. Okay, and the pharaoh at the top, in the original Old Kingdom, so at the beginning of Egyptian culture, the pharaoh had absolute power. And this changes over time. So you'd say Old Kingdom, you'd say absolute. And when I say absolute, I don't just mean on this earth. I really mean that the pharaoh is a god who is here for us. Whereas you get to the Middle and New Kingdoms, and it's more seen as a proxy or messenger of a god. And so what this looks like in real life, nothing supernatural going on, is the pharaoh was seen as absolute, having power both religiously and politically. And then in the middle, in the New Kingdom, what you have are more of the priestly class and your upper aristocracy complaining about not having political control. And so when they take control away from the pharaoh has less. And so the pharaoh's role is not as esteemed as a god, but now esteemed as a messenger for a god. This is very different than Mesopotamia. In Mesopotamia, you don't ever see the role of the king diminished. The king's role is there throughout the entire Sumerian culture and the Babylonian Empire until 1200 BCE. So the political and social structure, even though you have a lot of this, it really starts as, so the first part of ancient Egypt is in small states, almost like small kingdoms, and then ultimately they are unified, and this is really where we get into the main Egyptian culture. They're unified by Pharaoh Menes, or King Menes. And ultimately this is what solidifies this. And so really, as I mentioned before, King Menes would be an example of an absolute pharaoh, and then when you get later in time, maybe say like a Nefertiti, still very important Egyptian culture, but maybe not as much power as before. And so you would say the king's power eventually decreases. Okay, as far as technology, like I mentioned with the paper, very important, the papyrus, and also talking about irrigation. Irrigation methods, a lot of them were taken from the Mesopotamians, but it's important to know that this technology was also used, even bringing water into some of the homes, so you would even have that type of piped water in. And then you got your basic mathematical concepts. So I made the joke in class about your Ed Sheeran albums here, and really this arithmetic would be applied within the culture for different note taking and record keeping, and a lot of even the harvest, knowing the yields from each year to year harvest could be beneficial, especially for historians going back and trying to decipher what ultimately would have occurred. Okay, so I mentioned 3000 BCE to about 1000 BCE for the ancient Mesopotamians. Just to kind of contextualize this with the ancient Egyptians, as far as over here, your old kingdom, this is really from about 2100 to about 2000 BCE. So you can see that Mesopotamia is just even a little bit older. And then your middle kingdom, this is where the priests and the aristocracy take more power. This is about 2000 to about 1600 BCE. And then as far as the new kingdom, this is where we go from 1600 to about 1050. And so if we're looking at Jewish history literally based on the Hebrew Bible, it could contextualize, meaning the Jews break off from Mesopotamia in about 1200, and then the Hebrew Bible discusses an enslavement in Egypt, and so this would very likely have been during the new era, the newer part of Egyptian history. Okay. Going into our third river civilization, we're going to move it into the Indus River Valley. Now, both of Mesopotamian and Egyptian cultures had the opportunity to trade with the ancient Indus Valley, but it wasn't the native Indians. And so as far as the culture, we have this city, which we have two cities, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, but we focus more on Harappa. And really this ancient town had no walls, there was no military, but as a civilization they did have food storage, they did have irrigation, they did have this agricultural sedentary lifestyle, so they still function here, but there wasn't really as much of the warrior class. And so really what we have from the Harappas are archaeological data and information. And the reason I say archaeological evidence is we know they have writing, but we don't know what it says. And so we can say, yes, as a historian, this civilization has writing because we can see similar cuneiform figures, but we don't know what they say. And so we have to go by the artifacts themselves. But one thing we can figure out from the artifacts is there was no military, and there were also no social classes. This is important because ultimately the ancient Harappans, with their no military, are going to be invaded by a group known as the Aryans. So this Aryan race from the mountains come in. There's no military to stop them, and ultimately they are able to take over. And what they bring with them is what we would consider to be the early stages of Hinduism, and what they have are called Vedas, which are hymnals, songs, poems written about these spiritual belief systems. And the most important, your big book essentially would be the Rig Veda. And all of these are stories about the different gods and things like that. And so really what we're looking at is even things like the Bhagavad Gita, which provide metaphorical stories that give you essentially a moral code of how you would live your life. And so the most important thing culturally that the Aryans bring is the caste system. And this caste system will eventually be adopted within Hinduism. And understand Hinduism, it happens over years and years and years. And so ultimately this is used as a way to placate the native Indians. Aryans are not native Indians. They are indigenous to a mountain range northwest of the actual Indian continent, and they come in and bring their culture with them. And honestly, the caste system is a way to say we are superior to the people who are already here, and this is reinforced by our religion and both our social system as well. For the political and social structure, there is a political structure. It is unified, but honestly, there's not as much emphasis on that as far as the religion. There's more emphasis on the religion, is what I'm trying to say. But they did trade with both Mesopotamia and Egypt. Okay, and then we also see mainly the political and social structure is the caste system, as I mentioned. Now, as far as technology goes, it's very important to note that we see bronze and metal artifacts. So even though the Harappans did not use metal technology for weapons, we do see the Aryans, and which is part of the reason why they're able to take over. So we have these artifacts to go back to. We also note there is a written language. And then as with all of these cultures that we have talked about, there is presence of irrigation. Okay. Very good. Just to kind of finish this off with the river civilizations, we have three cultures that we looked at here. So the Chia and early Shang dynasty. Chia is no written record. This is one where historians are actually still debating at whether or not the Chia dynasty did exist. But if it did, this would be considered your first civilization within China as a sedentary lifestyle. But we really look at the Shang dynasty as the first Chinese dynasty, really because it's the first written record that we have of Chinese culture. And this kind of nicely fits the timeline that we've been discussing with these other things. So it's the first documented rule that we have. But what's fascinating about the Chia dynasty and really Shang China in general is they would have developed agriculture without trading with other cultures. So they would have been able to create this system of agriculture without influence from other cultures. And so this is a big deal. They're able to make this in isolation, and it makes us wonder what other things could the Chinese create in isolation that the Europeans and other cultures will get their hands on later. As far as the other cultures go, what you need to know about the Phoenicians is they did create a 22-letter alphabet. And the reason why this is important is because this is what will eventually become ancient Greek and ancient Latin, because it's using phonics rather than pictorial symbolic representation. And some speculate too, when you talk about the Phoenician alphabet, it does share the family with the Indo-European languages that would eventually become a lot of European languages, such as Greek and Latin, and then also plays a role and the development of Sanskrit within India. So Mesopotamia and Egypt, they only had the pictorial representation, same thing with China, but Egypt and the Indus Valley both had a script that they could write out that was more cursive than anything else. Now, the most important thing to understand about the ancient Jews is breaking off from Mesopotamia, they were really the first successful version of monotheism. They were able to sustain it. Now, we will also see Zoroastrians in the Persian Empire after Mesopotamia falls also create this monotheism, but many people speculate, many historians, religious historians speculate that there was connection between Zoroaster, the founder of Zoroastrianism, and the founding of the Jewish faith. Now, I don't know if that means an Abraham or something like that, but as far as the record goes, the timeline does fit pretty nicely here. So with the ancient Hebrews, you also see their moral code, which is the Hebrew Bible. And some of the things in the Hebrew Bible got cut off. Some of the things in the Hebrew Bible demonstrate a connectedness to the ancient Babylonians and Sumerians, because we see this Hammurabi's code make it as a similar type of law code within the Hebrew Bible. So what are we noticing as far as comparisons? Each of these river civilizations, I use that word intentionally, created advanced religious culture. And each of these cultures had a specific moral code, sometimes a little bit different than each other, but definitely some similarities, which we can see through the trade as well. And so really a connection there. Now, as far as the Jews goes, they will go into Egypt, and then they will settle in modern-day Palestine, Israel area. And then what we'll see is the Jews go in different times being controlled by other cultures. So when they were in Palestine area, they had been controlled by the Babylonians, and then the Persian Empire conquers the Babylonians, and so the Persians take over the Jews. And this is actually shown in the Hebrew Bible. Names like Nebuchadnezzar come up, and so really what this shows is how the Jews, although conquered, were able to maintain their monotheistic religion, which is a big deal at this time. All right, so moving on to part 3, we're going to look at features of classical civilizations. And ultimately, these civilizations are moving forward in time from the original river civilization. So the first cultures to adapt with agriculture would be the river civilizations, and then the classical civilizations are those that are really fine-tuning the idea of sedentary lifestyle. So these are essentially groups of people who are able to sustain even more as far as population, greater needs of a population, and really master the concept of what that takes to build what could be an empire. And so we'll talk about each of those. So first of all, just looking at some commonalities between them, although they have their own beliefs, lifestyles, and political, social structures, we will look at a lot of important similarities. And so one thing I just wrote here is patriarchal family. So it's really poor gender rights for women. I would say that the best place to be as a woman during the classical era would maybe be during ancient Sparta, with the idea that you could own property. But as far as early Christianity, women did have the power to be higher up within the Christian institution, so that sect of Judaism at that time. And we'll get into more of that in a little bit. So definitely patriarchal families, so a definite change from when we had the more egalitarian hunter and gatherers and even pastoral nomads. So all of these are agriculturally based. We see greater or lesser degree. We look at China being able to feed its people. We look at the Romans being able to utilize agriculture systemically across their empire. When then we see different things within the Greek Empire, definitely more of an emphasis on agriculture in Sparta than in Athens, and then we'll see everything kind of in the middle there. And then as far as the complex governments, I'm really just going to put a couple of concepts really so you can compare and contrast them. So starting with the Greeks, you have Athens, and although Athens begins as a monarchy, we ultimately know Athens as a democracy. We also understand that Sparta is a military oligarchy, meaning that you have the rule of the few, and these few would be some of the fiercest warriors. And then when we get to Rome, you also have Rome, and ultimately Rome will start as a monarchy, kind of coming from the concepts of the early Etruscans, but develop eventually into a republic. So understand that the Athenian democracy was direct, and then the republic was a representative democracy, and then it also developed into a centralized empire, where power was consolidated at the top with a single ruler, an emperor. And then in India, really the concept of politics was not nearly as important as any of the Greco-Roman cultures, mostly because of how prevalent the religious and spiritual ideas were, more about inward rather than outward reflection of life. But India had the caste system. And then we also have, as far as China goes, you have a couple of things. So during the Zhou dynasty, um, this is actually feudal. So it's very decentralized. And then when we get to the Qin and the Han dynasty, it's very centralized. And you have emperors that really take control in trying to create decisions for the entire nation. Okay, and then the last commonality that we see is expanding the trade. And so really after the Zhou dynasty, this is where we see the real development of the Silk Road. And so it's no coincidence that when we see the expanding trade, so the Romans would be trading with the Han. So I'll put the Han dynasty over here, and then I'll put over here, making this west, this would be Rome. And then in the middle of the Silk Road, you would have India as well, right? So all of these cultures are trading with each other at this time. And so China is definitely open for trade. Rome thrives on trade and is able to create an empire that can encompass very heterogeneous cultural background. And so this is really what we see as far as commonalities. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to get into each of the political organizations and give a few thoughts on how each of the cultures go, and then same with the social structure. So we'll do Persia, Greece, and Rome. We'll do the Indus Valley, and then we'll go through each of the Chinese dynasties as well. So with Persia, notice the dates, okay? So 550 BCE, and really what we look at as far as the start of the classical era is 600 to 500 BCE, and then it goes until about 600 CE. And so we're really looking at 1200 years here. And so looking at the fall of the earlier empires, the fall of the empires are really around 1000 BCE. And so we have about a 500-year span of just kind of chaos and decentralized civilizations. And then you see human civilizations able to unify. And so a lot of these cultures are based on that unification around 600 BCE. So the first one we see is Persia. And so they really are the first ones at this time to have the first effective centralized government. Understand that China and Rome are probably the most effective in centralizing their government over the long span, but at this time, the Zhou dynasty in China wasn't centralized. It was decentralized. So we see a lot of use of the bureaucracy, and so they're able to make a lot of important decisions and make those throughout the span of their conquered land. And so this starts with Cyrus the Great. So he's the grandfather that starts the whole thing. And then ultimately he has a son, Darius. And Darius will be a part of the Persian Wars with the Greek city-states. And then you have the grandson, who is Xerxes, who will be in the second Persian War. So maybe I could put first Persia here, and then I'll put second Persia here. Okay. So the other thing that we see as far as success and how they are able to centralize, and examples of how they're able to centralize, is they have a common language. And this would be for business, and this would be for the religion. And their specific religion was Zoroastrianism, which we actually see over here. I'll get to that in just a moment. But the common language demonstrates that the culture was centralized. And then a great way to centralize your empire from an economic standpoint is the impact of a road. And so this really improves communication. And it really ensures that communication does occur throughout your empire. And so if the Persian leader, the emperor, needs to create an edict and it needs to be spread to all of its subjects, then this can be very easily done if there is a road connecting the entire empire. And so this is a big part, and this is shows tremendous technological advantages, and then also the stress of the military. You can improve trade, and you also have military movement. You can move your military much easier when you're able to have this road. It also makes it safer for trade, so people are able to trade more. And then you also have things like inns and post offices. So you really have great connections. So you can almost think of it as like the arteries or veins that would come out of a human body's heart. And it's very much connected to the entirety of the empire. And an important component is they do have the centralized government, but at the same time, they're tolerant of their conquered people. So this creates peace, essentially. And this was something that I mentioned before with the Hebrew Bible, as it mentions that the Persians were in control of the Jews in modern-day Palestine, Israel area. And part of this is the conduct of the Persian Empire. As far as social structure goes, we really see that slavery was widely practiced, and this is something that we really see in all of the civilizations. Now, it was very much different than what we think of as the American slavery experience with the transatlantic trade, but it is still a concept that is very much in existence in the early civilizations, and this goes to show really just the control and the social stratification all the way down to the lowest level. And so within this culture, from a different level, we look at Zoroastrianism as the main religion, and then just a couple of concepts about this is it's monotheistic. This is another example of a religion coming out of Mesopotamia, similar to the Jewish faith. And then we also see a concept within Zoroastrianism of heaven and hell. And this is something that we will see in Christianity, which develops out of Zoroastrianism. And again, with the roads, you can easily trade and exchange these different types of concepts. And it really shows another example of a moral code. And this is very important to humans in every single civilization. There is some sort of moral code, or several moral codes for people to choose from. And then also understand that Zoroastrianism was influenced by Judaism. Again, it's the communication along those roads. Okay, so when we get down here, looking at the Greeks, because I'm going to get into the Persian Wars within the Greek section here, but that's really what you would need to know for Persia, and I do apologize for it. Okay, that's a little bit better. All right. So with Greece, most of the time the Greek city-states are at each other's throats. But if we look here, and really the Greek city-states, we look at around the 500 BCE mark. This is the time of the Persian Wars. It really goes to about 439. And there is a time of peace during this, but the two Persian Wars do exist during this time. And I'll put that there, and we'll get into that in just a moment. So understand that the Greek city-states originated from the island of for the Minoans on Crete. And the Minoans on Crete did not have a very strong military. They were very much peaceable. They did have a seafaring force, lived mostly on fish and things really from the Mediterranean Sea. And eventually these were conquered by the Mycenaeans. And the Mycenaeans are supposedly people from other islands that may have invaded. But again, the idea is that these individuals invaded the island of Crete, conquered the Minoan culture, and ultimately were able to create a culture there. They really had the concept of monarchy. And I mention that because the monarchy is the system that makes it into Greece as far as the Greek peninsula, and this is where we see the polis form. And so the political system, it's really the concept of city life and civic engagement. And so the concept of the polis is where we see the development of democracy. So Athens kind of begins as a monarchy, but eventually we see the power to the people. And this is where the political nature, and so you would say that someone would engage in politics, and that means that they are participating in their government. And this is a big concept within the city-states. And the polis is the idea that you would have a city-state that would individually choose its own governing style. And although the Greek culture is similar in a lot of ways, they were able to develop as island cultures separate from each other. And so the governing did vary. So in Athens, as I mentioned, we have that democracy. And then in Sparta, we have a military oligarchy. And a lot of this, and if I move this over to the side as well so we can see both, Sparta, women did have the most freedom. Absolutely. And so with the relative freedom, they really are treated more equally to men because women are responsible for birthing the warriors. And so if you don't have women, you don't have warriors. And they really understood this concept. And so compared to Athens, they really did have much more freedom. Even the concept of a woman being able to leave her home without her husband's permission is something that could occur in Sparta, but quite unlikely, even at the highest levels of the social pyramid. That would be very unlikely in Athens. So Sparta much more. And then so these governing styles really create the culture systemically from the top. So Athens as a democracy engaged in a lot of city planning and a lot of internal infrastructure and things like that, whereas Sparta really focused on their military and much more with the impact of geography. Athens is on the coast. And so this really means that they are going to have more of a navy. They're going to be a naval power. And for the most part, the Greek city-states, they really don't care about agriculture. They care about the military. And they care about governing and those types of things. So conquering and governing. And then with Sparta, they are more inland. So they are a little bit more with the agriculture, and this really helps them sustain a strong land force as far as military goes. And the impact of geography is it's very decentralized. The only time, and this is where I will talk about the Persian Wars, the only time that the Persians ever come together and unify is when they're fighting the Persians. Every other time, they're against each other and fighting each other. And so this is really what we see as a concept of unification and then deunification, and ultimately that deunification will lead to their fall to the Romans. So with the Persian Wars, I'm going to talk about it in two steps. So the first step is the original Persian War, where you have the Athenians starting revolts within Turkey, which is controlled by the Persians. And so the Athenians are trying to make sure that the Persians are unable to conquer the Greek peninsula. And so the Persians try to conquer Greece. And this is specifically under Darius. And then Darius is the son of Cyrus. So Cyrus founds the empire. Darius keeps it going and tries to expand, continues to expand the land that his father created. So he tries to conquer Greece, and the Athenians disagree. So they start these protests within Turkey, and the the Persians do not like it. And so ultimately, the Athenians and the Spartans come together. They defeat the Persians, and then the Persians are never able to conquer the Greeks. So you would say Persia lost. Okay. So there is a time of peace, and then the second Persian War begins by the Persians burning down the Acropolis in Athens. And so ultimately this creates the Delian League. So this is your first example of a major military alliance. So I made the example of NATO. So this would be like a classical era NATO. So it's really Athens and its growing empire, and Sparta and its growing empire, and everyone gets together and they defeat the Persians again. And this was under Xerxes. And so ultimately Persia kind of spirals out, and then at that point the Greeks go back to fighting each other, and then this is ultimately where we see the Peloponnesian War between the Athenians and the Spartans. And there may be a question on your exam, I think, about the Peloponnesian War, but to my knowledge, you don't need to know the specifics of that war, just the general concept that the Persian Wars, they're together, and then the other Peloponnesian Wars, they're kind of fighting each other. That's what you would need to know from that. One last thing about the Greeks to mention is really when we talk about the ideas here is with slavery up here at the top, most of the slaves would not be the citizens of that polis. They would usually be conquered peoples. And this is really how the Greeks justified their slavery, is they claimed that they were others, they weren't necessarily a part of their culture, so it wasn't as egregious. So the other thing we see about Sparta, just to mention again, is we do see women having more rights. So things like owning land would be possible. They could also own their own slaves actually too, but no voting for women. And then the last thing, social status dependent on land holding. So it's really owning land, and those would be about 10% of the people could vote, we'll say, in Athens. So this really means that not a whole lot of people are actually engaging in the civic behavior, but it's really just the aristocracy. And of course, with the philosophy celebration of human individuals, it's very important at this time that we have peace, that we can develop the different types of cultural innovations that we see in Greece. So ultimately, we see a lot of growth here, and then we move into the Roman era. So I'm going to move it down here. So with this era, we do see a lot of things that are similar, but ultimately Rome develops into its own major empire, and it really goes into two phases. And the first phase is the Republic, and the second phase is the Empire. So the Republic comes first, and the Empire is second. And ultimately, the Republic really starts out of a monarchy. So the Romans decide to get rid of the monarchy with the establishment of Rome, and then at that point they will create this republic. And ultimately the republic is run by senators, a group of senators, and these senators are ones that own land. So that's what that means as aristocrats, is they own land. And if you own land, you could be eligible for the Senate, and then at that point you would run, and then you would be able to create these decisions within Rome. And so these decisions is really, we have wealthy, I'm going to put this down here, wealthy senators. And then you would also have, as far as roles in the Senate goes, you have two consuls. And the consuls are the ones with the major executive power within the Senate. So you would say that the consuls are like the Speaker of the House within the House of Representatives in the United States. And they're able to make a lot of the budgetary decisions. They're able to have a lot of the military control. And then in times of war or times of great emergency, you could elect a temporary dictator. And the dictator would consolidate power for the purpose of security and prosperity of the empire. And so this would happen several times, but every single time the dictator would give the power back. And so ultimately, usually the consuls would be ones that had a military background, and a lot of this is respect to that service and its importance within the culture, and the dictator could play that larger role as well. And so the other thing that we see as far as the social structure is the basic division is between the patricians, the wealthy, and the plebeians, the free farmers, which are essentially poorer. The merchants could grow because we see more and more trade. Trade is a huge emphasis of Rome. So we'll talk about the increase of roads. So really, you take all the centralizing concepts of the Persian Empire, and they're very much expanded by the Romans. So we see with this middle class, merchant class, they really grew, and so merchants could grow rich because we have much more trade going on. And so a lot of this, which we see even in the founding of the United States, is there's a lot of power within those who own land. And if you don't own land, you can't be a part of the patrician class. Okay, I'm going to move over to page 4. So if you flip this over, so this is still Rome, and we're going to continue really to more of how it turns into an empire. So think of the previous page as more of the Senate, as more of the Republic, and this is Rome, and we'll say this is the empire. So ultimately, this is more from about 43 BCE to 476 CE. And again, you don't need to know the specific dates for the actual test, but this is just trying to give you context with where we are with the other cultures. So around this time of the Roman Empire, this is around the time of the Qin and Han dynasties in China. It's the time of the Mauryan dynasty within India, and so ultimately this does bring together a lot of things going on at the same time. The transition from republic to empire starts with the first triumvirate. Rome is huge. Rome is expanding its empire so large that it is unable to control the extent of its empire. So ultimately what it is going to do is this first triumvirate, which is between Julius Caesar, Crassus, who was one of the consuls, right? So consuls are military leaders. Crassus was a military leader. And then you also have Pompey. So one thing I mentioned in class is Julius Caesar's daughter actually married Pompey. And ultimately, the first triumvirate is a way for these three individuals to kind of swoop in and take power of an important situation. Rome is kind of struggling. The Republic is unable to meet the needs of the people, and these three individuals are trying to capitalize on that weakness. And so they see it as a golden opportunity to step in. So Crassus dies in a military campaign. And so ultimately what happens is Julius Caesar at the time has been in Gaul, and he has been conquering what is modern day France. And so he has a lot of military that are very much loyal to him. In the meantime, Pompey is in the Roman Senate. So he is in Rome saying we need a republic. And so these two individuals, you have a civil war. And so those who are in favor of Pompey, I put a P, is for the republic. And all those that are with Julius Caesar, Caesar says the republic is dead. Caesar says we need an empire. We need someone to consolidate power. And so ultimately what happens is Pompey has the republic. He's now in control of the Senate, and he says to the Senate, we need to stop Caesar. And so he orders Caesar to come to Rome and to not come with his military. Caesar says no. Caesar comes down the Rubicon, comes south into Rome, and ultimately obliterates Pompey's forces, and then Caesar is able to take control of the Senate. Caesar creates himself dictator for life, and then Caesar is ultimately stabbed um, in the back in the Senate. And so ultimately, at that point, you have the group of senators that supported Caesar, those that said that republic is dead, we need an empire. They ultimately continue on Caesar's ideals. And then ultimately, you would say the first emperor is Octavian, also known as Caesar Augustus. And when I say Caesar in this regard, this is Caesar as a title, meaning emperor, not Julius Caesar. So we'll say Emperor Augustus. And Emperor Augustus did a lot to really expand the empire and had a lot of social reform. Throughout the Roman Empire, you see extensive colonization. You see the building of roads, you see the expansion of the military, you see safer trade. So again, like we see with the Persian Empire, we see expansion of that and really advanced technology. And so with the consolidation, we would say that the Roman Empire is its largest at 117 CE. So this is definitely time within the empire. This is after the time of Augustus, but the empire has been established for over 100 years, about 150 years. And so ultimately, this colonization is due to the expansion during the Punic Wars. So this is where they conquered North Africa, which was formerly Carthage. Carthage was the capital of the empire, and ultimately the Carthaginian Empire is conquered during the Punic Wars. In the First Punic War, Rome ultimately fights in Sicily and is able to conquer parts of the Carthaginian Empire, and so they pay tribute. And then they decide Hannibal goes over the mountains into the Swiss Alps and into Rome with his elephants, and their troops are defeated again. So Rome now conquers the Carthaginian Empire. And then the third war, basically the Romans get greedy and they decide to just burn and obliterate the entire Carthaginian Empire, and then they control all of North Africa, all of Sicily. And that's where they salted the fields. And so the reputation militarily is you don't mess with the Roman Empire. And that really is where the tolerance goes as far as the social role here is the tolerance. And it's a big if. You are very tolerant if you don't disobey Rome. And this is where Christianity plays a role here, which we'll get into in just a moment. So just finishing up Rome here, understanding that the empire itself, getting closer to the end and to the conquering, it really settles into two empires. And so you have the West, which is Rome, and then Constantine actually makes the capital of Constantinople. And so you really have what will eventually be the Byzantine Empire. You have Constantinople, and you have two capitals in Rome. So Rome is really able to connect things. So going back to the road concept here, Roman law, which we see with the 12 tables, is ultimately what gives us individual rights. But ultimately, if you were conquered by the Romans, you were considered to be a citizen. And so everyone had the same individual rights. And so although difficult to enforce as a law system, it shows a similar law system that's unified throughout. So ultimately, the concept of rule of law, right? Everyone is equal under the law. This is something we will see later as well. And so again, attitude towards conquered people, they would be tolerant. But if you disobey Rome, it's not going to be a good thing. And so ultimately, the end of Rome, right, comes from things like overdependence on slavery. And really, the wealthy did not really care about expanding or things like that. And so ultimately, the end of the empire comes from Rome not being able to satisfy the needs of maintaining such a vast empire. And so the end is really from conquering. And they're really called barbarians. And this concept is not necessarily negative. It really just means that someone is a non-Roman. These people would have been north, and so now Rome is being conquered, and that's where 476 comes in. That's ultimately where the Rome is burned by the Vandals and the Visigoths. And then so another term we see at the Roman Empire is we see this term pagan, because eventually Rome will become Christian under Constantine, and so pagans are really non-Christians, and they would follow the Roman law. Okay, that's it for Rome, so let's get into China. Okay, so getting into the China section, and I just want to point out before we begin, at this point of the lecture, we have about 25 minutes left, and I know what you're thinking because there are tons of pages left. How are we ever going to finish this in 25 minutes? You'll notice that the rest of this, especially after we go through the religions in part 4, so the religions are part 4, and then part 5 really gets into kind of the cultural elements and then getting into the fall of the empire. And a lot of those things are written out for you and not necessarily emphasized, because remember, your midterm is based on the questions that are on the study guide. And so this information are giving you pieces that you can use in those questions. So think of it as you are name dropping terms, so as specific as possible as you can put concepts in. So one could be this mandate of heaven, know that it's a feudal system. We'll talk about Confucian values. These are things that you can input into your short answer questions on the midterm. So we will be able to finish in the allotted amount of time. Okay, so getting into China. Notice the date, 500. This is the time of the Persian Wars between the Greek city-states and the Persians. It also starts around the time of the Roman Republic. And so really what we're getting into here is the Zhou dynasty. While Persia is centralized, while the Greeks are now unified, and then when you talk about the Chinese, compared to the Romans even, the Chinese are very decentralized. And that's because China at this time is a feudal system. But we have this concept of the mandate of heaven, which enforces the rule of the emperor, which we see in other, not mandate of heaven in other cultures, but we see different things to reinforce the power of the emperor. Christianity was used this way to reinforce the power of the Roman emperor, and then we'd see Buddhism to reinforce the power of the Indian emperors, and then we're going to see the mandate of heaven with the Chinese emperors. And so you really have this permission. And so the emperor is chosen from the Chinese people as someone who is given permission from the heavens to rule over the Chinese people, and then you have this period of relative peace. And during this peace, everyone is pretty much happy, and they approve of the way that the emperor is ruling over the people. And then you have chaos, which in the terms of China usually deals with peasant revolts, fighting from outside forces, nomadic tribes, and then also from greed within the empire itself. And then you would have calls for a new emperor. And so ultimately it would go into the circle, and the new emperor would have the permission. So this would be the circle that the mandate would follow. Now with the feudal system is ultimately it did not work, because it was successful only when people were trustworthy, and this relies on loyalty. And if you are not loyal to the person above you, then the whole system is going to fall apart. And so really you would say it relies on loyalty, but this broke down. And so ultimately the emperor would be falling out of favor and wouldn't have the mandate anymore of the people, and this system just fell apart. And so ultimately you see the change in China. It can ultimately unify when you have the creation of Confucianism and Qin Shi Huangdi utilizing legalism. We see a change in China. And that change in China is really when we're looking at the concept of a centralized empire. And he had the mandate, and so this is the Qin dynasty. And what he did to centralize is they would collect taxes. And the taxes would be used for services. So the purpose of the emperor is to protect its citizens. So if they're collecting taxes for the emperor, those services would be things like a wall to protect you from northern invaders. And so a lot of this is really embodying the concepts of legalism, really that people are ultimately evil and they need to be reminded and drawn in by strict laws. That is how we can control people. And when you broke Qin Shi Huangdi's law, he took it personally and was pretty brutal in that regard. And we see a lot of development continuing after Qin Shi Huangdi with the Han Dynasty, strong centralized government supported by the civil service exam. So you have this bureaucracy, and they embody the ideals of filial piety. So the respect to elders, respect to different relationships that Confucius brought up. And so really they bring in the political system with the cultural ideals of Confucianism and legalism. Now, as far as the social structure goes, the family is the basic unit of society, and this is where the filial piety comes in. I do apologize that this is very poorly spelled, but we're going to move on. This is filial piety, so it's the loyalty and the obedience that is stressed within the family, and this is going forward even towards the emperor and things like that. And so there's an emphasis on learning. So wealth generally based on land ownership, but still emphasis on the self and learning, not money. So trade was not something that was necessarily respected the same way in China as it was in Rome, and that's because the learning played such a larger role in this culture. And so most of the land ownership was higher wealth. And so we do see a lot of this wealth concentrated in cities. And so ultimately, the big divide between rural and urban settings is something that you see to this day in China. And so the development of these cultures really over the last 2,500 years shows something. So this is something that developed during this time that we still see today. Some slavery, not as much as in Rome. Really not as much of a need because you have so many people that can work the agricultural land as an agrarian society, but definitely patriarchal, very, very strict. And so a lot of these values are ones that are presented in the Analects. And so in general, China goes from being decentralized under the Zhou dynasty, and then they become much more centralized during the Qin and the Han dynasty. And then that's what you need to know. For ancient India, we see India at the same time period here, and so the lack of political unity is something that is very common with India. We will talk about the unification under the Mauryan and Gupta dynasty, and the significance of these two dynasties are mostly because they are rare, meaning the time periods in which India is unified are very, very small in comparison to the amount of time that India is decentralized in these small, fragmented kingdoms. And so within India, you could kind of compare these small kingdoms to Greek city-states. But again, politically, you would very much say that the politics within India were on the back burner compared to the politics that you would see in the Greek city-states. But from a political standpoint, as in small, decentralized, non-unified structures, this would be the comparison that you would make. And so you really see the strong connection to the social hierarchy based on the caste system, partly the allure of Buddhism that spreads during this time is that the poorer group of individuals and those, the untouchables in the caste system, are able to have a closer spiritual relationship and a better life potentially because the caste system is not used in Buddhism, only in Hinduism. So as far as the political unifying, we don't see this until the Mauryan dynasty. And so ultimately a lot of the caste membership, if you want to talk about a political system, the caste system would define your group. And this would define your politics. So however high up you can get in society is determined by your caste system. If you can't do something based on your caste system, well, the promise is that if you do well in this system, you follow the Dharma in this life, and then you could potentially be reincarnated as something better going forward. So the times of unification we see are the Mauryan dynasty. The name you need to know is Ashoka, Ashoka the Great. He was a very ruthless leader, and ultimately he did convert to Buddhism, which is very much a peaceful religion. So this is a change You could maybe compare Ashoka to Constantine in Rome. So really he goes from ruthless to converting to Buddhism. So just like Constantine was very ruthless, created edicts to kill Christians just for being Christian, and then ultimately converted himself, just like Ashoka converted to Buddhism, and created Christianity as the ultimate religion of the empire. Now, with this, understand that really because the political affiliation wasn't as big of a deal in India as the religion. The religion is really what plays a big role here. So you would say that Mauryan starts Hindu, and Chandragupta Mauryan is the one that founded the empire, but his son Ashoka is the one that says he becomes Buddhist. And then what we see with the Kushans is the Kushans were Buddhists, but they were foreigners. And so ultimately the Mauryan dynasty fails to address the needs of the empire, so the Kushans invade. And this ultimately, because they're foreigners, a lot of the Indian people, or a majority of the Indian people, don't like this, and so the Guptas are able to take over because they are both Indian, native Indians, and they are also Hindu. And so they are really trying to go back to the traditional values and go back to what they feel India should be, which is ultimately a Hindu nation. And so the last time we see for a very long time the centralized India is with the Gupta Dynasty going back to Hinduism. And so from this point on, really most Buddhists are kicked out because of the Gupta policies, and the Buddhists go and spread the Buddhism into China. And so from this point on to the present, there are much more Hindus in India, mostly because of a lasting legacy of the Gupta Dynasty. Now, as far as we look at women's rights during this time, there is a decline. Women did have some property rights, but you really see the process or the treatment of women go down during the Gupta Dynasty. And part of this is the women's rights under the Mauryans were based on Buddhist ideals, so women had better rights. Okay, some property rights, but even we talked about like a curfew in the Greeks, you could go out, and then in the Gupta you would have less rights. Now, as far as Hinduism goes, one concept that is used during this time that will eventually be outlawed is this concept of sati. Very gruesome, eventually will be wiped out by both the Indian government when it becomes an independent nation, but also, also the British will cut it out when they take over India as well. Okay, now we're going to go just briefly into a couple of these belief systems. I did put a little bit more writing for each of these so you can be able to kind of look through. So I'm just going to kind of do a broad compare and contrast of each of these, and then we'll go through the last of the cultural systems. Okay, for part 4. Looking at the new belief systems and cultural traditions, we see a lot of things emerge, but also spread. And the spreading is really an emphasis within each of the religions, and I'm going to compare and contrast which ones were more emphasized the spreading of their religion. Okay, as far as Buddhism goes, Buddhism really comes out of Hinduism, and Buddhism starts with the prince Siddhartha Gautama. The Buddha means the enlightened one, so Siddhartha would be a Buddha, but far from the only Buddha within the concept. And so Siddhartha sat under the Bodhi tree, and he meditated, and what ultimately fruits of his meditation is he was able to reach nirvana, discover his past lives, and then discover that life is suffering, and the way to escape the suffering are in these 4 noble truths, and the path and the moral code, and the way to get there is the Eightfold Path. And so we see another moral code evolving out of Hinduism, and so it's really the concept of moderation and balance. This is part of why women had more rights during the Indian rule of the Mauryans because of the Buddhism. So what do we see as Buddhism spreads? Ashoka converts to Buddhism. And then we also see it spread through missionaries. So we see Buddhist monasteries within India, but we also see them in China. We will see them spread to Korea, and then we'll see them hop over into Japan, and then go down into Southeast Asia, into Vietnam, which will eventually go down into Thailand, into different types of things. And really the concept of missionary is really that they're spreading the religion. And then the last concept is you see a lot of education. This is why the politics are not as important in China or in India, is because of the spiritual concepts. So the education is you see monasticism within Buddhism. And this is the concept of a monk. Okay. So moving on, we go into China to look at Confucianism and understand the major founder is Confucius, and really this came about during the era of warring states. This is probably the most important transition in Chinese history during this time, because this takes us between the Zhou and the Qin dynasty, and Confucius was really trying to bring harmony back into China, ultimately disillusioned during the time of the era of warring states. So what Confucius talks about in his Analects is social harmony, and part of that is by following certain rituals. These exist for a reason, and these bring peace and harmony and allow people to live good lives. And so the main concepts he talks about are his 5 relationships, the concept of filial piety, and then with civil service, this will lead into the bureaucracy. Well, the civil service exam is your understanding of Buddhist ideals. That is how you will get in to the bureaucracy. So the filial piety is that respect to parents and really understanding these different ideas. The Analects is very much a big part of this, and really comes about during that chaos at the end of the Zhou dynasty. Okay, I'm going to flip this over here so we can continue our discussion about belief systems. So I'm going to mention a couple thoughts very briefly. Don't need to know a whole lot about Taoism other than there's one question potentially that could be on your exam. But with Taoism, it's really about harmony in nature, and the little government comes from the fact that government is not important. And ultimately, harmony with nature would be a much more important thing. And so really within Chinese culture, a lot of medical theories in Eastern medicine, come out of this. And then as far as a major cultural concept, we see the yin and the yang as a concept here. So that's it for the Eastern religions. We're going to focus now on Christianity. This comes out of the teachings of Judaism, and our main founder is this Jesus of Nazareth. And he was a rabbi. So he was a teacher within the Jewish faith and created this cult within the Jewish faith that believed that he was the prophet to come and judge the world and save the world ultimately as the Messiah. So this messianic figure ultimately died and is said to have rose from the grave. And so the term Christian, although comes much later after Jesus of Nazareth, it arises out of Judaism. And so a lot of these teachings, ultimately, you could talk about the fact that Jesus was raised Jewish. And you could say that Christianity, so you could say Christians, comes later. So very much a small cult. And so the basic beliefs really on here, and so do unto others as they do unto you. I mean, this is something you see in the Analects. This is also something that you would see within Buddhism as well. And so really a commonality, a common thread here. And then you also see the importance of the teachings of Paul. And so when you have this connection, ultimately with the Edict of Milan, Paul was a persecutor. He would kill Christians, and then he became a main teacher of Christianity. And so Christianity being developed and adopted as the main religion within Christianity comes from Constantine and his bedside conversion. And he ultimately sees things on the battlefields that causes him, I can't read that either, that shows that he should be a Christian, and so he makes it the official religion. So the great irony is that Rome had specifically and intentionally gone out of its way to persecute and kill Christians because their belief was that Jesus was higher than Caesar, was higher than the emperor, and then they eventually make it their official religion. And it's able to spread because of the roads and technology that Rome had. Okay. As far as the missionaries, they will spread the religion, and this is another big part of Buddhism that you could compare to this. And that's really what you need to understand about this concept of Christianity is it arose out of Judaism, and just like Buddhism became a state religion in India, you can also talk about the fact that Christianity became a state religion within Rome. As far as Greco-Roman thought goes, you think of your spa philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And ultimately, these individuals focused on human reason. This is what separates us from the animals, is our ability to think and reason. And ultimately, when you talk about Plato, he talked about the ultimate political power, the greatest form of government that you could ever have is this concept of philosopher kings. And the philosopher kings would ultimately be thinkers, and you would have one ruler that would make the best decisions, and this is ultimately what he thought would be the best form of government. Okay, as far as social development, cultural development, these are not something that are necessarily emphasized on your exam. These are things that I'm going to encourage you to go over on your own. So if you flip it over onto the next page where we get into part 5, you can see I put different artistic ideas, religious ideas, architectural ideas for Rome. I put some things for China, and then it really looks at these golden ages. So in Rome, you have the Pax Romana, okay, and then in China, you have the Golden Age with the Han Dynasty, and then in India, you have the Gupta Golden Age. And the reason why I'm going over this, just to be intentional, why I'm not going over this in great detail, is not that there are not a lot of questions on your actual exam that deal with a lot of the cultural elements, but these are things you can help to kind of create a connection between these cultures. So if we flip it over to one more, this is the decline. This is the very end of these cultures, and so I have a few thoughts here while we have just a little bit of time that I want to offer just to give you an idea of looking at this from a graphic standpoint, from a graphic organizer. Can we see how cultures did three things? How did they first expand and conquer? And once they conquered, once they really expanded their empire, how were they able to integrate their cultures? How were they able to spread their cultural influence? And this is where you would put your golden ages. And then ultimately, why did they fall? This is why we had our Socratic seminar on the fall of Rome. But understand that the aspects of why the Roman Empire fell are common in why the other empires that we looked at in the other spheres of the world. So we really break this down into 4 regions: Greece, Rome, China, India. And so each of these we really look at. So with Greece, we look at cultural, not territorial. They didn't expand their territory like the Romans, like the Chinese, and some of the Indians did with unification. But with this, we're talking about the spread, and you could even talk about like the Hellenistic era. The Hellenistic era is important because it spread Greek culture. And we talked about some of the negative things, meaning like the earth is at the center of the universe, and that idea was wrongfully spread to a lot of different regions and wasn't corrected for a long time. But ultimately, the spread of their culture is a huge expansion and the foundation of Western culture. And then when you talk about the common language in this regard, it would be Greek. Okay, and then when we fight the Persian War, they're really coming together. So this is an example of unification. But in general, the decline, because of the geography, the city-states make it hard to unify as well. And so really more of the Greek history is the Peloponnesian War, which is Greek versus Greek. The Macedonians take over. Hellenism ultimately takes over and is the link between the Greeks and the Romans. So getting into Rome, Rome basically goes from Greece to Hellenism to the Roman Republic. The Republic is developed and ultimately works to satisfy the needs of the entire empire, and so it increases its control. It is very tolerant of other cultures. It does have a common language called Latin. They have a common law system called the 12 Tables. Citizens are those who are conquered by the Romans. And so one thing that we see is you do see a golden age in Greece under the time of Pericles as a golden age. And then you also see this Pax Romana as sort of the beginning of the end. So as the peace comes, eventually you have a lot of different reasons for why Rome falls. But some of these are the issues of the economy. There's a lot of issues with the agriculture and the loss of pride in the agriculture. And then ultimately you have plagues. So you have disease and people losing faith in the empire's ability to deal with these crises, and then poor leadership, and also you have invasion from these nomadic tribes. And so ultimately Rome does fall apart. It splits into east and west, Constantinople in the east, Rome in the west, and ultimately the west falls in 476, and the east lives on, which will eventually be the Byzantine Empire. And the last kind of final thought going into the other part of the world here with China and with India. If I could move this over a little bit here. Okay. So what we look at with China and India is now you have West and South, and they're being able to be unified together. So in the beginning, the expansion of China is the first time China has been unified. Ultimately, is this time during the Qin and the Han Dynasty. Now, the other thing that we see between the north and the south is where rice is grown versus wheat is grown. And now that we're able to unify the two regions, we can really have both supplies in there as well. So another thing to add going into the integration is the common language, the Chinese language is used here. There's a strong centralized government that is solidified by the mandate of heaven. And ultimately, just like you see Christianity as a common religion within Rome, you will see Confucianism as the main belief system, along with legalism with the laws, but Confucianism as the use for the civil service exam. This is a part of the strong centralized government. Highly organized bureaucracy really dominates here as well. As far as the end, really what we're looking at are the taxes. And so too high of taxes and too poor of services, compounded with poor harvests, poor yields, and then emperors that are unable to connect with the Chinese people and really distribute the services they need to be successful. So you have weak emperors, compounded with people from the north, which is why we built the Chinese Great Wall, was to prevent the nomadic invaders, and then the Yellow Turban War rebellion is a good example of peasant uprisings. And this is something that is very much a part of Chinese culture. When we talk about the mandate of heaven, we will always talk about how there's going to be issues with weak emperors, nomadic invaders, and then also fighting from within. As far as the Indians, to kind of wrap this up, you have the Maurans who are able to centralize. So India, for the vast majority of its culture, is decentralized in small kingdoms, similar to Greek city-states. But the Maurans are able to centralize. They will be Buddhist, and then, or they will be Hindu, and then Ashoka will convert to Hindu, or, I am so sorry. The Maurans will start Hindu, and then Ashoka will convert to Buddhism. And then under the Guptas, they will be the Hindus that restore Hinduism and really persecute Buddhists within India, so Buddhism spreads into China. So understand that the caste system is Hindu only. And so we do see a difference in rights. Women had more rights under the Buddhist control of the Maurans under Ashoka and his posterity than with the Hindus under the Gupta Dynasty. And again, the empire grows, and the nomadic invasions ultimately cause the Indians to unfortunately not be able to keep their empire. Thank you so much for being patient and positive with this lecture. If you cannot read any of my writing, which, trust me, I do understand, I do not take offense, please email me with any and all of your questions. Send me an email with 10 questions. I'll send you 10 answers. You guys are going to do a great job on this midterm.